Hi, good evening, everybody, and thank you for coming. My name is Dawn Suter, and I am co-chair along with Rebecca Ryder of the League of Women Voters of Johnson County's series on the U.S. Constitution and the Supreme Court, their impact on your daily life. This series is sponsored by the League of Women Voters of Johnson County's Education Fund. Our co-sponsors for this evening's program are the University of Iowa Public Policy Center and the Iowa Policy Project. And we have speakers from both of those organizations tonight as well. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization that promotes the empowerment of an informed electorate. We research public policy issues at the local, state, and federal levels, educate citizens and decision makers, and work to find reasonable solutions to our most pressing policy challenges. We invite you to join the League of Women Voters of Johnson County. Membership is open to both men and women, and the membership forms are on the table in the hallway as you come in. This is the final program in our series of 7 on the U.S. Constitution and the Supreme Court. It's been a 14-month labor of love and some frustration, but overall, it's been fantastic, and I know I've personally learned so much from all our great speakers and from all of you as well. So thank you for coming and contributing. I would like to say a special thank you for financial support for the series to Humanities Iowa and the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Johnson County Bar Association, the Hawkeye chapter of the ACLU of Iowa, Hills Bank and Trust, Iowa City Human Rights Commission, West Bank, University of Iowa Community Credit Union, Technographics, and Hotel Vitro. Please refer to the program for a complete list of the series supporters who have worked with the League to make this community event possible. They're on the back of your program. The title of tonight's program is The Affordable Care Act, Is It Constitutional? I'm guessing that most of the people in this room are well aware that the Affordable Care Act has been before the Supreme Court, and we're kind of waiting for a decision as to what that's going to look like. And so we're going to be touching on that. We're going to be touching on where the act is now, kind of how it was organized and where it stands, and then we'll kind of go on to look at what's the future going to look like both ways, whether it stands or not. The formal program, we have 3 presenters, and that will last for about 45 minutes to an hour, or an hour and 15. And after that, there will be audience questions. We'll set up a mic in the middle aisle before the audience questions. Please come to the mic if you have a question, because this is being broadcast live, and if you're not mic'd, we won't be able to hear your question. So we are very pleased to have our presenters tonight. Professor Sheldon Kurtz, Percy Bordwell Professor of Law, University of Iowa, Professor Peter Damiano, Director, Public Policy Center, University of Iowa, and Andrew Cannon, Research Associate, Iowa Policy Project, and all of their biographies are also in the program, so please refer to that for complete detail. And we'd like to start the program tonight with Professor Damiano.
Thank you, Dawn, and good evening, everyone. I want to thank you all for coming out on this beautiful evening to come and hear about the exciting healthcare reform discussion. I'm going to leave the what's going to happen to Professor Kurtz, and he's going to have his crystal ball. No, I'm just kidding. He's not going to do that. But what we're going to do is have a little discussion. First, I'm going to start with what is the ACA? Why are we talking about this? Why are we here? And then Professor Kurtz will go into talking more about the legal and the Supreme Court issues, and then Andrew Cannon's going to talk about what happens, where do we go from here, depending on what happens with the decision. So one of the things I like to start out with is what is actually driving us to even talking about healthcare reform? Why does it really matter? And one of the things that we can't ignore, although I don't want to focus on too much, is that this is obviously being done in a very political environment. And I'm not here to talk pro or con about the ACA. What I'm going to try to do is just break it down to what are the aspects that have already gone into place and what are the things that, as scheduled, will happen primarily in 2013-14 when this will go in. As director of the Public Policy Center, what we do is to do background research to try to inform policymakers about a variety of different issues. In my case, it's healthcare issues, but we're not advocates pro or con. That's not what we see our role as, but more just to try to inform policymakers about different sides of different issues. And so that's what I hope to be able to do with you today, what's already gone in place. Again, not pretending that this isn't being done in a very political environment, but sort of talk about that as it really affects how it goes into place. But as many of you are well aware, the reason that we're talking about it at all are these three issues, really primarily healthcare costs, but also access to care, and that's a big part of many of the components of the ACA, but also quality of care, which is now tied into a number of the aspects that we don't talk about that much with the ACA, but pay for performance and in terms of system performance reform, and we can get into that later into the discussion if you'd like to, but those are some of the things that really could have a very profound effect on what happens if this goes into effect, if the law goes through, in ways that we normally are just focusing on the health insurance coverage, and that is a lot of what I'll actually be talking about as well. But first you have your quiz. And so how much does the United States spend on health care in any given year? How many people would say $500 billion? Per person? I'm sorry, actually that is a mistake. The per person is given to you, so if you can, at the bottom, so you can multiply that by the number of people in the country, then you'll be able to get the answer. How many say B? How many say C? Okay, how many say D? All right, the majority said C, so you're a very bright audience. Yes, it's around $2.7 trillion a year is what we spend on healthcare in the United States. Yes, you can go home now. And it is finals week, so it's kind of a fitting time for that. So in the way some terms, more than budget Dutch, right? So why does it matter? What does it matter how much we spend on healthcare? Whether we spend $1 billion, $1 trillion, $3 trillion, $10 trillion. It's not sustainable. Why isn't it sustainable? But this is, I mean, one of the premises that I will start with in terms of where I come from is that, and it's not just mine, but we don't really have a healthcare system in the United States, right? And even President Bush's Secretary for Health and Human Services, he described it as having a group of healthcare sectors rather than having a healthcare system. We don't globally say we're going to spend $2.7 trillion a year because we believe that's the right amount. Right? It just sort of happens. And we don't look for where the need is in the country and decide this is where we're going to place our resources, right? It's just going to happen. And for the most part, those people with the most resources also tend to get the most resources back. So we know that people with insurance use more healthcare resources, for example. But why does it matter? These are jobs, right? That $2.7 trillion is going into the economy, it's jobs. What's the difference? Well, we don't put much into public health, right? And there was a recent Institute of Medicine report talking about how a fraction where we're spending, $8,000 per person, and we spend about $250 per person on public health. And a lot of the things that we actually need to do to improve health status are things that can only be affected by public health. So that would be sort of a shortcoming on where we're spending it, but again, it's because of that lack of planning, if you will. But what's the difference what we spend?
It's rising too fast.
Okay, rising too fast. We know it's been rising in general faster than other aspects of the gross domestic product, although actually the last year or two has been slower. But again, what's the difference? Because it's jobs, it's employing everybody. Yes?
We're not getting good outcomes.
Well, on top of it, we're not getting good outcomes, depending on how, when you look at that, and you probably have seen many of those international health comparisons and showing that we're spending more money than everybody else and have, lower or higher mortality rates, lower life expectancy, some of those things, and actually do a whole lecture on that I can tell you why none of those things aren't true. But that is one of the issues that we don't feel like we're getting the bang for our buck. But there's something that economists call opportunity cost, which you're kind of all talking around, and that's that idea that any dollar we're spending on healthcare is a dollar that we can't spend on something else, right? Whether it's on the environment or defense or whatever your priorities are, we do have somewhat of a limited amount, and so that's really somewhat the issue. And that's true at the state level, where Medicaid, for example, has been becoming such a huge proportion of the state budget, and so that means every dollar we're spending on Medicaid is one less dollar that we can spend on education, for example, or at the federal level, wherever we might want to spend it. So that's really the big issue when you talk about that. And this is that international health comparison, one view of it. There's a lot of different ways to portray it. But on the left here is, on your left, is going to be 1980. On the left graph is average healthcare spending on healthcare per capita, and over on the right is as a proportion of GDP. And so you can see in 1980, there wasn't that much difference really between the United States and other industrialized countries, but by now the difference is huge. And that's another aspect of this healthcare spending that's a little different than the opportunity cost, but it's the competitiveness, right? If you're making cars, and for example, many of the Detroit manufacturers, it costs them roughly $1,500 of the cost of the car, they say, goes to the health insurance of the employees that make it, where you're competing against manufacturers in Germany or Korea or Japan, where their healthcare costs are going to be lower, there's going to be a competitive advantage right there. And so that's one of the cost aspects that's important to consider. And then there's some of the access to care, which many of you are familiar with, depending on what numbers you want to believe and how you want to cut it. But at any particular point in time in the United States right now, there's about 50 million people that are without health insurance, on, again, any particular point. Then there's going to be other people that are going to be rolling during that. And that's up 13 million people over the last 10 years. And why do you think that is? Why do you think there's a growing number of uninsured? Well, jobs, right? Part of it is when there's higher unemployment rates, people are going to be losing their benefits as well as their jobs.
Higher cost of insurance.
Higher cost of insurance for employers, for example, right? So employers are pushing the costs onto their employees or eliminating insurance coverage at all. And the types of jobs that we're creating often are going to be service sector jobs that are not going to have full benefits. We don't have as much collective bargaining, so regardless of what you might think about unions, without that collective bargaining, you don't have someone arguing on your behalf for benefits. And so now, especially in the private sector, we're at such a low level of unionization that's also been a factor in that. And we've been seeing a significant declines, they say they're in employer-based insurance, from 64% of the population with insurance in 1999 got it through their employer, down to 55%. Medicaid is now a slightly higher proportion of the insured and a slightly higher number than Medicare. And that was just a big switch a couple of years ago, where Medicare was always sort of the gorilla in terms of federal and public insurance coverage. And this is something that just came out, a report from the Commonwealth Fund about a survey that they did of insurance coverage last year for people last year. And huge difference is not surprising to many of you by income, and that 57% of low-income families, defined as about $30,000 for a family, 4 or less, 57% of them were uninsured at some point during the last year, and 41% for a year or more. So large proportion, and the thing that's really important about that is these are not people who aren't working. 80% of the uninsured are working people and their families, so it's the fact about where they work, not if they work. And so you could have two people doing the exact same job, two printers, for example. I think of my two uncles who are both printers. One of them might offer health insurance coverage and the other one doesn't, and there's no way, because of how expensive it is, that person that doesn't get the benefits through their job are able to afford to go out and buy it. And so this is what employers are facing. Well, this is actually first the profile of the uninsured by income. And so you can see on the left, that's the uninsured versus the total population. And the much larger proportion, again, different way of showing that lower income group that's going to be much more likely to be uninsured. But this is the issue that then becomes really important in terms of, well, they should just go out and then buy some. Well, again, that's a nice thought, but when it's $13,000, $14,000, $15,000 a year to be able to go out and purchase health insurance coverage and you're a low-wage employee, there's no way that you're going to have that kind of disposable income. And actually, this is one of the questions that I have with the ACA if it goes through, because it's still going to be relatively expensive for people to buy it, even through the exchanges, even with the subsidies, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But this is also why employers are continuing to push the costs onto their employees, because many of those employers are not necessarily, especially the small businesses, have a high profit margin, and so their costs have been going up rapidly. Do you have a question? Okay. So the act itself, one of the things, if you remember nothing else, that I hope you will take away, because I think this is one of the most misunderstood, most of the insurance reform aspects of this are aimed at the individual and small business market. Okay, it has nothing to do, or not almost nothing, but almost nothing to do with the employer-based coverage. And most of the employers who offer health insurance to their employees are actually self-insured. And so they avoid insurance regulation through something called ERISA. We won't go into all the details, but that's really separate. These insurance reforms are primarily aimed for the person that goes down to the Farm Bureau office over on Mormon Trek and goes and buys a well-marked Blue Cross Blue Shield policy for themselves or their family because they don't have dependent coverage where they work or something like that. Those are the people that have been facing 10, 20, 30% increases per year. They're the ones that have had pre-existing condition clauses. They're the ones that have annual maximums. They're the ones that they get sick in the middle of the year, they get dropped, or it becomes so expensive for them to re-enroll. So most of the insurance reforms are aimed at that group of people. And that's something that I think is very missed when you think about this. But it's also a reason I think it's also not as popular among many people. Because it's like, I've got good coverage, what's in it for me? And so why are we spending all this time and discussion and energy talking about this when I'm fine? But this is really the group that's been getting hit hard. So this is what I think healthcare reform looks like to many people. And it isn't just healthcare. At the Public Policy Center, we look at everything from transportation issues and environmental policy issues and housing and any complex policy issue. Wall Street reform, for example. That's what this looks like to me. Even though I try to kind of understand some of it, it's very difficult for us to wrap our heads around all of the complexities about this. So what I try to do when I talk about this is break it down so that you can understand at least some pieces and components of that. And it isn't, as it says there where President Obama, maybe I should have been a little bit more specific. It is hard to be that specific because then you have people complain, well, it's a 2,000-page bill. And how could I ever understand it? Well, there's going to be 2 million pages of implementation at the federal, state, and local level. And that's where it is really going to make a difference on whether this is going to work or not. It's not the 2,000 pages. That's just rough guidance. It's where we're actually going to put this into place will make the big difference on whether this is going to work or not. The other thing, and I don't mean this in a political sense, but I think it's important to take away because that early slide when I was talking about the politics, we can't ignore it. This has been sold as, what are some of the things that you hear about it from a negative perspective? Socialism, right? Socialized medicine. Government takeover. Death panels, yes, that was a good one. Especially since that was originally put forward by a Republican House member in Florida, as some of you probably know, to just get payment for end-of-life counseling into Medicare, which everyone would generally say is a good thing. But yeah, this is actually what I consider a right-of-center approach. And the reason I say that, if you think about the spectrum of ways that you might address the problems we were talking about at the beginning, a far-left approach would be a national health system, similar like they have in Great Britain, where the government would own all the facilities and all of us who are healthcare providers would be government employees. Okay, that would be sort of the far left. From there, as you move right, the next over will be a national health insurance or provincial or state or whatever, similar to what they have in Canada, where theirs is a provincial insurance, but the delivery system is private. Then just left of center, I would consider more like what the Clinton healthcare reform, one aspect of it, which was going to be an employer mandate. So instead of now where we've got the onus on the individual, there the onus was on the employer. Then this is a slightly right of center approach, where the onus is on the individual, and it was originally proposed by those who were more conservative because they didn't want to lose the private health insurance companies. And so how can we drive people into the private sector? And even though it's talked about as a government takeover, and there are aspects that are, government aspects of this, or government programs, things like that, this is really we're driving more people into private insurance than into public insurance through this. And so I think that's an important thing to consider. Again, not that it's good or bad, but it's just very different from the way that it's often spun. And so this is one of the reasons that I also think that it sort of feels different depending on which side of the political spectrum you are, where the Democrat, the donkey there, the patient is the healthcare system, and we've got a crisis and we've got to do something about it. And to the elephant there, it's like, well, wait, they're just here for a checkup, meaning, we don't have that big a problem. Now, Dr. Miller Meeks is the director of the Department of Public Health. When she and I gave a talk like this, she corrected me and she said she wouldn't say that the Republicans, which obviously she is, would say that it is not a crisis. It's just they would focus more on the cost than on the access issues. So what is the cost? Estimated to be about $940 billion for the first 10 years. And actually, most of the conclusions have been it's going to reduce the deficit over time, which again is different than what you might have heard. There have been some more recent ones that have said maybe it will actually increase the deficit. And it's interesting, it's not because there's differences in how they're calculating the dollars, but just where the flow of dollars would go into the trust fund versus into the deficit, into the general fund. But overall, it's not necessarily going to break the bank. On the other hand, does anybody trust these numbers? No. You know, you'd be crazy to trust any projection going out 10 years on any program this size. You look at the Medicare projections, the original ones in 1965, and by 1967, they were so far off in terms of what the program cost. So some guidance, but no, it isn't something you can put too much on. And again, whether these are going to be accurate entirely or not, we don't really know either, but this is what the Congressional Budget Office has estimated where we're going to be driving people, private insurance versus public insurance. And so their numbers are we're actually going to drive 24 million people into private insurance through the exchanges and about 16 million into public insurance, and that's primarily going to be adults in Medicaid is what that group is. There's some kids, but like in Iowa, we've done a great job of already covering children. From our recent data, we're at about 2.5% to 3% of uninsured children in the state. And 2/3 of them are actually eligible for Medicaid or the state's Children's Health Insurance Program, Hawkeye. It's the adults, though, that we need to do some work on. So what's already in place? There's already 43 components of the law that have gone into place, which again, most people don't really realize. They might know a couple of them and then are thinking everything's going to happen in 2014. But there's a lot of the things, and this is where Professor Kurtz is going to be talking about the severability issue that the Supreme Court is weighing in on. So what's going to happen to all of these things if the Supreme Court does rule that the individual mandate is unconstitutional and that you can't sever the different components of the way the law was put in place? One of the lowest hanging fruit was one of the things that they put in right away, and that's covering kids up to age 26 on their parents' insurance policies. Low-hanging fruit because it's very inexpensive. This is a low-cost, low-risk group other than an occasional pregnancy and an occasional, poor birth outcome. This group is very cheap. This is one that it does affect employer-based insurance as well, but we've picked up about 2.5 million of the uninsured who are in this age group since this has gone in place in the fall of 2010. So this is, I would say, a very successful one at very little cost. The second one, which was a holdover, so when we get to 2014, because a lot of the getting rid of pre-existing conditions and other those things were not put in place for adults yet, so they wanted to set up a new round of high-risk pools to try to offer the high-cost, very sick adults some place to go. That hasn't worked very well. And because you're pooling the highest cost, highest risk people with other highest cost, highest risk people, and so you end up with a very high cost insurance, even subsidized. And so it hasn't been very successful. The elimination of pre-existing conditions is an interesting one, and I'm not one who tends to bash insurance companies because I think in general they're doing what they're supposed to do within our system as we have it currently set up. Now you could argue you don't like the system, but I think they're not necessarily doing anything outside of it, but this one was a little questionable. And a lot of the things that were done were based on that the insurance is an industry, said that, and this is where the individual mandate came from. The individual mandate came about because the insurance company said, we'll get rid of pre-existing conditions and we'll get rid of annual maximums and all of those other things that with those individual and small group policies, as we talked about earlier, if you bring everybody in. So it's not just the moral hazard issue of the sick people who would buy the insurance, and that's where the individual mandate comes from. It's actually being driven by the insurance companies, not as it's being spun as a government takeover. Now again, you could argue whether it's a good or bad thing, but that's not where it came from. But so one of the first things they put in place was for children's policies back in the fall of 2010 is they got rid of pre-existing conditions because that's what the insurance company said they would do if they pool everybody together. Well, as soon as they did that, anybody know what happened? You might think premiums went up. They just stopped selling it. So for a couple of months, Instead of going back on their word, they just stopped selling children's insurance policies. So for Iowa, for 2 or 3 months, you couldn't buy a children's only insurance policy. So that's a little questionable. That then is back in place. Then there's what's called the medical loss ratio, which you might be familiar with. And this was because there's all this talk about a lot of mandates in this, but there are actually very, very few, including what the cost of these products are going to be when they go into the exchange. So one of the ways that they're trying to deal with costs is trying to say, well, Medicare and Medicaid are actually more, the administrative costs are lower for those programs than for private insurance. And so to try to drive the administrative costs for the private insurance down, they're saying that they have to be, depending on the type of insurance company, are 15 or 20% for your administrative costs, and all the rest you have to demonstrate you're going to go put in from the premiums into the actual care provision. And this is what's called the medical loss ratio. You might have seen something recently, they're talking about there's going to be a bunch of rebates coming back for the companies that didn't meet those medical loss ratios, and then they have to pay a penalty. So that's one of the ways that they're trying to improve the administrative efficiency of the program. This was the lifetime maximums and things that I was talking about, and the caps. Then there's a small business tax credit that you may have just even heard today. There was a story out finally that's talking about this. And this is one of the things that hasn't gotten a lot of play for some reason. And I'm not sure it's actually a huge incentive for small businesses because the cost is so high. But it's also not a thing that's going to kill small businesses because there's no small business mandate. Small businesses don't have to provide insurance now. There's not going to do anything different. But if they do have off their small business and offer insurance, they get a 2-year tax credit up to 35% of the premiums. So there's at least a small incentive there. They're going to review the costs, if not set them, which will help. Financing for this, you may have heard about the tanning tax, which is, sort of a funny way to go about do that. I like to tell the story that it was a story that was told to me by one of Senator Grassley's aides who was in on the discussions when, most of this bill was actually written by 3 Republican senators and 3 Democratic senators, of which Senator Grassley was one of this gang of 6 up until the Republicans pulled out at one point because they didn't like the way the discussion was going or was going to pass, depending on how you want to look at it. But this was originally, according to him, it was going to be a Botox tax. And he said you had Nancy Pelosi, you had Speaker Boehner, became a tanning tax. I don't know if that's true, but I thought it was a great story. And then nonprofit hospitals are supposed to conduct a community needs assessment, and that there isn't a lot of guidance at this point in terms of what that means, but it's sort of an interesting thing. So if it does go through, so what's that? So the individual mandate is set to begin in 2014, and everyone through your taxes will then have to demonstrate that you've got insurance coverage. The interesting thing, the week of the Supreme Court discussion, the Urban Institute, which is a slightly right of center, but very well balanced and very solid policy institute, came out with a study that showed that the individual mandate and all this fight about we're making people do anything, it affects actually 6% of the population. If you break it down between everybody that has insurance and the uninsured who aren't going to be forced for a variety of reasons, it really only affects about 6%. And from our research, most of those people actually want coverage. It's not like, you heard a lot about that broccoli discussion, like we're trying to force feed people something they don't want. Well, most people really do want insurance coverage, they just can't afford it. So I think that's, again, a slightly different way to look at it. There will be an employer mandate on large employers, but 95% of them already offer benefits. So again, it's not going to affect a large proportion, but there will be a few. Some of the McDonald's types, and you may have heard these mini med plans and trying to get those approved so that it's really not insurance and low cost, they're going to have to struggle a little bit. So you may pay, an extra 10 cents for your hamburger. The big things, though, is the Medicaid expansion is going to begin and the health insurance exchanges are going to begin. So the health insurance exchange I would think of as sort of this online health insurance bazaar or Expedia type of thing when you go in and you're going to pick your plan. And there's going to be 4 different benefit levels. They're talking about a bronze, silver, gold, and platinum. It's going to be set at the state level in terms of, and there's certain guidance, and we won't go into all the detail in terms of what they're supposed to base that on. And then you'll go in and you'll be able to pick those people who are uninsured through this exchange at a subsidized level from all of those. And so for children, you're going to have Medicaid going up to 133% of poverty as it does. And again, this isn't really going to change anything in Iowa because we've already done these expansions. The Children's Health Insurance Program called Hawkeye here will go from 200 to 300% of poverty. And then the exchange or actually 133 to 300 technically. And then the exchange will be subsidized from 300 to 400%. For adults, that's going to be the bigger change, and there's roughly 11% of adults in Iowa that are uninsured. So they're going to, everyone is now going to be covered up to 133%. And the big change there is right now to be eligible for Medicaid, you have to be both what's called categorically eligible, so you have to be like a pregnant mom or meet different categories as well as being poor. Now you just have to be poor, and then you'll be eligible for Medicaid, and then the exchange kicks in. So that's just sort of a visual way of thinking about that. These are some of the estimates from the Congressional Budget Office on what the cost will be. And if you go back to that, $13,000, $14,000, $15,000 for a family, it's going to be a significant subsidy, but it's still estimated to be, for a family at 100 to 200% of poverty, anywhere from $2,000 to $4,000 a year. And so there's still going to be a fairly substantial cost in whether a lot of those families, and they can claim hardship that they can't afford it and opt out. But it's going to be challenging, and even as you move up, it's still going to be tough. But yet, if you think about how much we're subsidizing people to buy private insurance, that's part that I'm not sure how sustainable it is.
When you're talking about the poverty line, is that going to be for an individual, for a family of four? Which poverty line are you looking at?
Well, it varies a lot. As you know, the poverty line is set, and from some work that actually the Iowa Policy Project has done, poverty is probably right now at about 220%, I would say, of what we call the poverty line in terms of what is poor. What do you need to be able to get by with the basics?
What I'm wondering, does the Affordable Care Act say, when you say 100%
Right.
of federal poverty line, is that for an individual?
It-
Because they state it for individual.
Right.
people.
I mean, the individual, that would be for what the level is, and I can't tell you if it's $14,000 for an individual, but it's based on what the federal guidance is.
So if you're a family of four trying to get insurance, you'd have to be 100 to 200% of the poverty line
Correct.
for a family of four.
Right, and one of the big changes that isn't also talked about a lot, it's going to be based on your tax returns, which is a very different way of calculating poverty than the Medicaid program does right now. There's different issues right now in terms of what you're allowed for your savings and other things like that, and this is going to be done through taxes. And that's a big difference. So these are some of the benefits that are going to be required as a part of it, but not fully paid for, okay? Just a couple of things that I just want to just throw out for discussion later, if you want to talk about that. And these are some of the issues that are happening with delivery system change in the state that isn't talked about a lot, but is going to go on probably regardless of what happens to the law. So Medicaid and Iowa Care is a program for uninsured adults up to 200% of poverty that's a limited benefit to certain provider program. But we've had a huge increase in enrollment in that program. Medicaid has been increasing. That's not going to go away, especially if the ACA does go away. A movement towards medical homes, health homes, we can talk about that a little bit as a way of improving quality, coordination of care, hopefully. Costs for those who are what are called dual eligibles. They're the disabled and Medicare eligible group. Highway Health Information Network that's going to connect all the electronic health records in the state and be able to communicate more effectively. That's going to be a big change coming up. What's the impact on the safety net providers, on the federally qualified health centers, community health centers, rural health clinics? We've got a study going on right now funded by the Commonwealth Fund to look at that. And accountable care organizations. This is going to be a potentially big delivery system change where it's being driven by Medicare right now, but Wellmark and others are looking for ways to pay in what's called a capitated way per person per month payment and putting some of the risk on the healthcare providers and on those groups. That's something that's going on right now. There's what's called a Pioneer ACO project going on in Fort Dodge, and there's going to be an expansion of that. So those are some things just to throw out there for discussion, and I will now turn it over to Professor Kurtz.
Let me turn that off.
Let's see if I can.
If you like slides, I'm going to disappoint you because I didn't bring any. So first, very much want to thank the League of Women Voters for sponsoring this series on the Constitution. been very educational for our entire community, and I think it deserves a lot of credit for it. So on March 23 of 2010, President Obama signed into law the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, cryptically known as ACA and pejoratively known as Obamacare. The legislation was far from being bipartisan. It passed the House and the Senate with no voting support from any Republican, although, as Pete pointed out, many of the Act's provisions reflect the work of some Republicans over the course of many years who worked with the Democrats in trying to fashion some solution. Within 1 week of the president signing that law, the president also signed a reconciliation bill, patching up some problems with the act that became immediately apparent. And both bills, ACA about 2,200 pages, and the reconciliation bill, a mere, I think, 200 or 300 pages, are effectively treated as one act in the conversations that have been going on since they were signed into law. Now, while the provisions of ACA are being phased in over a period of years, I think the last set of provisions come into play in about 2019, the most significant provisions from the point of view of expanding access to health care go into effect on January 1 of 2014, assuming, of course, that the Supreme Court does not strike down the whole law or any of its significant provisions. As Pete pointed out, one of the goals of healthcare reform has been expanding access. And my remarks basically are going to focus in on that. In my view, at the heart of expanding access for healthcare are 4 provisions included in this act. First, a provision that requires insurance companies to provide insurance to individuals without regard to any pre-existing medical conditions. Under the bill, this is called guaranteed access. Second, it requires that most persons have health insurance. I should rephrase that. It's almost all persons, okay? There's a peculiar way, if you look at the act, in which we talk about who these persons are, all right? Don't think of the total population of the United States, because there's a whole group of them that aren't even covered by this act. So I should say that it requires most persons to have health insurance either from an employer, purchased privately, acquired from the government, would be the third way. The next thing the act does is imposes what's called a shared responsibility payment. I want to drive that phrase home to you. It's called a shared responsibility payment. You may not have read about that phrase in the paper. We'll be talking about that phrase a little later. But it imposes a shared responsibility payment on individuals who fail to have health insurance. And lastly, it expands Medicaid coverage to about 16 million more Americans, and ultimately the cost of that program to the states. Sort of as an aside, the federal government has promised to pay 100% of this expansion cost up until, I think, 4 or 5 years after it goes into play, and then the states will have to take it over. So as you might imagine, when Pete's pointing out about an opportunity cost, $1 spent here and $1 spent there, while covering new members of the Medicaid program will be a federal responsibility, which has its own opportunity cost. Once the states have to take that over, it's going to be a big item for the states to have to deal with. It didn't take very long after the president signed this act for the lawsuits to begin. And there were a number of them all over the country. In 3 of them, and here I'm probably talking more like a lawyer, in what we call the 3rd, the 8th, and 9th circuits, but I assume you know that our federal court systems, we have district courts, which are your trial courts. We have these intermediate appellate courts, which are called the circuit courts. And then we have, of course, the Supreme Court. So I'm now really focusing in on those intermediate appellate courts. There are 11 circuits. The 3rd, the 8th, and the 9th considered lawsuits, but dismissed them all on a technical ground that the plaintiffs in those suits lacked, in law talk, standing, meaning the suits were brought by the wrong people, okay? So those suits have gone nowhere. In the Fourth Circuit, the action was dismissed on the grounds that the Federal Anti-Injunction Act bars challenges to a, quote, tax before a taxpayer is sued for non-payment by the federal government. So in other words, in that one, they threw it out as untimely. Not the wrong person brought it, but it wasn't brought at the right time. You have to wait a while, okay, i.e. after 2014. In the 11th Circuit, and this is the one that really counts, the court struck down as unconstitutional the individual mandate, but upheld the Medicaid expansion program. And then subsequently, the District of Columbia Circuit upheld the individual mandate, and that's what sets up the Supreme Court, because now you've got one of our circuits that says the individual mandate's unconstitutional, and you got another circuit that says that it's constitutional, and typically whenever we have the split in the circuits, the Supreme Court needs to resolve it, like as Chief Justice Roberts said when he was confirmed, we're going to be like the umpire, right? So somebody's got to decide. With this background of division amongst the lower courts, the Supreme Court has said, took the case for review and set up oral argument in March. And the first thing that happened for lawyers, this was so unusual. They announced, this is such an important case, we're going to give the lawyers more than an hour. That's the standard for a Supreme Court oral argument, 1 hour. This one, 3 days, close to 6 hours, okay? So we know something big is happening when we're going to get that kind of an oral argument schedule from the United States Supreme Court. And this is probably, from the point of view of money, the biggest case that ever came to the Supreme Court since Social Security, okay? All right, now, at the core of the legal battle going on now is a broad constitutional provision relating to the scope of the power of the federal government. Individual states, Iowa, have the power to engage in all kinds of regulation of human conduct under the so-called police power, which is the power to legislate for the health, the safety, the morals, and the general welfare of the state's citizens, subject only to not violating principles of due process, equal protection, and the liberties that we all adhere to in our Bill of Rights. On the other hand, the federal government is a government of what we call limited powers. It is empowered to enact legislation falling only within the specific authority granted to that government by our Constitution. Now, I'm sure you all know that the Constitution was enacted in 1789, and therefore it would come as no surprise to you that nowhere in that document will you find the phrase health care. And nowhere in that document will you find the phrase health insurance. Therefore, if ACA is a proper subject of congressional legislation, it can only be as a result of the interpretation of one or more enumerated powers that the Constitution has already granted to Congress. And it is the Supreme Court in our system that is the final interpreter of the Constitution. Hence, we're at the Supreme Court. Now, I think everybody agrees that there are two specific enumerated powers in the Constitution that one might point to either to support upholding the law or to support not holding the law. And they are the Commerce Clause and what we call the Tax and Spending Clause. The Tax and Spending Clause, I'm sure all of you remember on April 15th. Under the Commerce Clause, Congress has the power to regulate commerce among the several states. Existing case law, that is, cases already decided by the United States Supreme Court, support the notion that Congress can regulate economic activity that rationally finds its way into the stream of commerce among the states. So, for example, no one really disputes anymore that Congress can dictate the width of interstate highways, right? Trucks are going from state to state to state. Congress can regulate that. But the constitutional language in the Commerce Clause, Congress shall regulate commerce among the states, does not make any reference to or distinction between economic activity and economic inactivity. And that's going to be the core of the challenge. The challengers to the individual mandate claim that a decision not to purchase health insurance constitutes inactivity, and that inactivity can't be connected to interstate commerce since there's no commerce going on. Nothing's going on. From this, they argue that the individual mandate must be unconstitutional. They argue that to compel persons against their will to purchase a product that they don't want would be unprecedented and an impermissible extension of the commerce power, and that if it were allowed, there'd be no limitations on what the federal government could do. While, so the argument goes, it may be perfectly appropriate for the states to exercise, as part of their police power, the command to purchase insurance, the Massachusetts plan, Congress is not vested with the police power the way the states are. And what states can do doesn't mean Congress can do. But of course, there's another side. There's the government. And the government claims, of course, as you might expect, that their individual mandate is perfectly okay. It argues that everyone at some point in their life will need and will use health care. And so the argument goes, given that the need for health care is unpredictable, Congress can require the uninsured to buy insurance now, even though they don't currently need it, in order to limit the costs that will ultimately be imposed on others when the currently uninsured go down and get their health care. Sometimes this is called the free rider problem. The government also argues that the sale of insurance is clearly in interstate commerce and that it's appropriate for Congress to require that policies of insurance sold in the market not include exclusions for pre-existing conditions. From that, it argues that under the congressional directive that Congress can enact laws necessary and proper to executing its enumerated power, that is the Commerce Clause, Congress can therefore mandate that people buy health insurance because everybody's got to be in the risk pool. Everybody has to be in the risk pool in order to make it economically feasible for insurance companies to sell policies to people who are already sick. And that's the point Pete was making earlier. The mandate is coming not from the government as much, well, it's coming from the government because they passed the law, but the impetus, the political impetus, is the insurance industry. Because the elimination of pre-existing conditions has been popular for years, and I think across the political spectrum. But the question is, how are you going to finance it? Because everyone also agrees it doesn't seem quite right when the person's just been diagnosed with cancer that they now buy their insurance policy. Opponents of the legislation reject the notion that healthcare and health insurance markets are necessarily linked, and that while Congress may have the power to regulate healthcare markets, it is not self-evident that it is necessary and proper to regulate the insurance market in order to regulate the healthcare market. And this led to a very interesting exchange, if you listen to the oral arguments between Justice Kagan and Justice Roberts, where she refers to the notion that they're not linked as slicing the bologna very thin, and leading Justice Roberts to point out that, well, you know, food is in interstate commerce. Does it make sense, therefore, that we can force people to eat broccoli? So, the other challenge to the individual mandate, and there's more than one challenge, relates to the so-called shared responsibility payment, that phrase I mentioned earlier, and whether that can be sustained under Congress's authority to levy and collect taxes. The government argues that the shared responsibility payment is effectively a tax because it will be administered through the tax code and is reasonably related to the collection of some federal revenue. The opponents disagree, arguing that the payment is not a tax at all. Rather, they argue, it is a sanction for not engaging in certain kind of behavior. Thus, it is a penalty and not a tax. And that's the word, of course, you hear in the newspaper all the time, that the shared responsibility payment is a penalty, not a tax. From this, they argue that imposing a penalty is not permissible under the tax and spending power clause. The clause says tax, and this is not a tax, a very formalistic argument. And of course, there's all kinds of debates on whether, a tax is a penalty or a penalty is a tax. And they can go back and forth and, count the angels on the head of the pin while they're doing it. Now, a really tricky question for the court is what happens if the individual mandate is struck down? The court could hold that the mandate is so central to the entire law that if the mandate is unconstitutional, the entire law must be struck down as well. That is what a federal trial court actually held. The Supreme Court could hold that only the mandate falls, or it could hold that only the mandate and the prohibition on pre-existing conditions fall, leaving the rest of the act intact. How come we have such a tricky question? Well, politics. Often when Congress passes a statute, it includes a clause in the statute that says something like, if any provision of this act shall be declared unconstitutional, no other provision of this act shall be affected. They didn't put it in the Health Care Act. How come? Ted Kennedy died. And so what happened is they realized that they made a goof. But by the time they did, Senator Brown had been elected, and that meant there was no longer 60 votes to take up further measures. So since there's no severability clause in the legislation, the court is going to have to decide what the impact of striking down any one or more provisions of this act would have on what's left. And I believe you're going to be talking about that, right? Okay. All right. Now, the other major challenge in this act relates to expanded Medicaid. And in many respects, to me, this is, from a legal point of view, the far more interesting. The state challengers claim that the expansion unconstitutionally coerces states by conditioning their receipt of all federal Medicaid funds, including those that they currently receive, on their provision of coverage to an additional mandatory eligibility group, that is, adults under 65 with household incomes of 133% of federal poverty level, which I think currently is about $14,500 per year. They allege that federal Medicaid funds, are so important to states' participation in the Medicaid program that compliance with the new eligibility requirements has become so coercive in a way that Congress should not be allowed to do under the spending clause. The government, on the other hand, argues that Congress may attach whatever conditions it wants to federal dollars that it sends to the states, and that so far no court has ever struck down any conditions imposed on the states by Congress when the states took money from the federal government. It also argues that Congress has frequently expanded Medicaid eligibility rules, imposing additional costs on the states in order to get those continuing federal dollars. A decision striking down this section of the law could have enormous impact on a whole host of federal statutes that condition funding on compliance with predetermined federal norms. Helmet laws, drinking laws, construction projects. All of these things often come with social or political ties to the dollars coming from the federal government. And the current Medicaid expansion provision is simply another illustration of that. If that one gets struck down, it's going to be a wonder to watch what's going to happen after that. Of course, in Iowa, we don't have to worry about the helmet law because we don't care about people wearing helmets, okay? So anyways, that's where things stand. Now, the question I'm most frequently asked is, what do I think is going to happen? Well, I can tell you with absolute certainty, it will not be 9-0. And that's my forecast. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to you.
I'll just take it a second to come back up. In the meantime, you can.
Great. Cue it up. Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'll be continuing along from where Professor Kurtz left off, and we'll be talking about this nightmare scenario. What happens if it is struck down? And I call it a nightmare not because of my own personal preferences, and not simply because it would be a nightmare for the Obama administration and Democrats, but because of some of the reasons that Dr. Damiano laid out before. A number of these provisions have already gone into place. Millions of people are benefiting from these programs and provisions already. So let's take a look at some of those. We'll recap some of those. There are the tax provisions. Taxes have already begun to be collected on medical devices and indoor tanning salons. So what happens there? Do they receive a refund if it is overturned? How do we deal with that? Second, one of the points that Dr. Damiano spent some time on is the provision that allows young adults to stay on their parents' coverage. This will affect up to 2.5 million, 2.4, 2.5 million people who have, young adults who've gained coverage because they've been able to rejoin their parents' plans. Now in Iowa, interestingly enough, Iowa has a provision that allows young adults to stay on their parents' plans up to age 25. So the number of Iowans who would be affected by this provision being repealed would actually be pretty small. But nationwide, it would have pretty significant consequences. Another one, no fees for preventive care. Right now, preventive care in some plans is free as a result of this law. So you'd see patients would begin to have to pay co-pays or full price depending on their plan. And that puts providers in a difficult situation. Not only do you have the recipients, the insured population facing this difficulty, but it puts providers in the difficult situation of telling their patients that they now need to pay for a service for which 6 months ago, 3 months ago, 3 weeks ago, an hour ago, they didn't need to. Another thing that would come back are annual and lifetime benefits. Insurance companies would be able to say, you have this policy, we'll cover up to $1 million per year of health care coverage or something like that. And I think that would be a lifetime, actually, $1 million. There's this ban on rescissions, a practice known as rescissions. This was one of sort of the fireworks during the debate over the law in Congress. Some insurance companies were cutting people from their insurance rolls when those people got ill. Insurance companies said that those people had committed fraud when they applied for the insurance by not identifying pre-existing conditions. In some of those cases, the fraudulent omissions were shown to be pretty minimal, such as not mentioning a mole or things of that nature. And then, of course, the reason we have that picture there is the donut hole. Is anybody familiar with what the donut hole is? Anybody want to venture an explanation for us? Politics.
That's right. So in 2003, Congress and President Bush created a law that expanded Medicare, created a prescription drug benefit for Medicare recipients. Now, unfortunately, in part of that law, they left a big hole. Recipients in this plan could receive up to a set amount of benefits for prescription drugs, at which point they ran into the donut hole. There was nothing there for them. They would have to pay full price of those prescription drugs until they reached the other end of the donut. So I think it's something like $1,500 benefit. Sorry? $2,500, $2,300, something like that? Okay. And then they have to spend another $1,200 on their own until that donut hole is recovered. Well, the Affordable Care Act attempt to address that, it provided seniors a $250 benefit to help narrow the donut hole this year. And then it was going to, the benefit was going to be expanded in time. So under the nightmare situation, that donut hole would return to its full size. So under this situation, what happens next? What do we do now? Well, there are a number of options. The first one is, probably seems likely at this point with the way Congress seems to be operating, do nothing. The second one, we could move to a more free market approach, which is something you hear Republicans suggesting quite often. The Democrats, particularly the liberal wing of the Democrats, have favored a single-payer system of some sort, in which everybody receives insurance, which is paid for through the government. It would probably be closer to a Canadian system or a Medicare for all, where the insurance would be covered by the government and doctors would still be private employees. Another option, a hybrid that isn't the ACA, that somehow manages the pitfalls that the ACA has fallen into. And the other one, back to the old status quo, which I suppose is kind of the same as doing nothing. So let's take a look at some of these options and see what they might look like. So, do nothing, I think we can imagine what that looks like. The second one would be a free market solution. So if you think about healthcare reform options as lying along a spectrum, you'd have free market on one end, single payer on the other. The Affordable Care Act probably falls somewhere in the middle. It uses market forces, as Dr. Damiano explained, by increasing private insurance participation, but it also increases some regulation on those insurance plans, and significantly, as both the preceding speakers mentioned, it would expand the Medicaid program. So depending on your point of view, you may think it may be left of center or right of center, or maybe even a little closer to one of those sides, but it's hard to argue that it's not well within sort of the 25-30% central region. So a free market solution, what would that look like? There's a think tank in DC called the Cato Institute. They're a well-known libertarian think tank, and they've actually been quite consistent on health care, unlike their counterparts of the Heritage Foundation, which actually crafted some of the language that went into the Affordable Care Act during the 90s, and who have since decided they don't like many of those provisions. But here are some of the ideas that the Cato Institute has floated to reform the healthcare system. The first one is health savings accounts. This is another creation of the 2003 Medicaid or Medicare expansion under President Bush. That law enabled the creation of these health savings accounts. So these are accounts in which employees can put pre-tax dollars in conjunction with a high deductible health plan. These health plans usually only cover catastrophic coverage, so they have a deductible of $25 or $35 or $5,000. $2,500 or $3,500. So the person with that plan is on the hook for paying the full price of a doctor's visit rather than just having a $15 or $25 copay. The idea here is that this would help consumers become better consumers, wiser consumers. They would have more skin in the game, is the phrase that is often used in conjunction with these. It would help consumers make better educated choices about where they receive their care, do comparison shopping before having procedures performed. The second thing that Cato and other free market advocates suggest is changing the tax treatment of health insurance. Right now, if you receive your health insurance through your employer, you and your employer do not pay taxes on that benefit. So if you have a $13,000 health plan, no taxes are being paid on that. Even if you're paying $5,000 of that and your employer is paying $8,000 of it, and $5,000 of that is coming out of your paycheck, that's pre-tax money. So they would change that. They want to get away from a group-based or job-based insurance system and move to an individual one in which individuals have full control over their insurance plans. And the idea there also is that makes health plans more portable. You don't have to worry about not changing a job or not becoming an entrepreneur because you're tied to a job because you have great health coverage. The next item is deregulation. They would deregulate health insurance markets. This would enable consumers to buy plans that don't cover services that they might not need. Women could buy plans that don't cover maternity, for instance, if they don't plan on having any children. So that's the idea behind deregulation. And of course, that would mean states would no longer have the regulatory power over insurance, which means that you could buy insurance across state borders. And of course, another reform that we always hear from the Republicans is the idea of tort reform, changing the way that the legal system rewards victims of medical malpractice and errors. Interestingly, Cato is actually relatively moderate on tort reform. They would not limit non-economic damages to the same extent that we've seen a number of Republican proposals for tort reform. And these proposals would change Medicare and Medicaid as we know them today. Medicare would go from being a defined benefit plan in which you know you're getting a full insurance benefit to a defined contribution plan in which the government contributes a set amount of money to a voucher which you would use to go purchase insurance. And the idea there is that health plans would compete against each other to keep their prices down so that seniors who are Medicare eligible would be able to use their voucher. And Medicaid would be highly restricted, limited to just the disabled, moving the poor and low income to private insurance or uninsured. So the GOP has offered some alternatives, though we haven't seen many alternatives in the past several years. Most of these alternatives that I'll be discussing in the next couple of minutes come from 2009, so before the health law passed. And interestingly enough, most of these proposals look quite a bit like the Affordable Care Act. They have exchanges, state-based exchanges. They have insurance market reforms, including prohibitions on pre-existing condition limitations. They have high-risk pools. So many of the things that we see happening in the Affordable Care Act, their major point of departure from the Affordable Care Act is that none of them included an individual mandate, and none of them had a Medicaid expansion. And the most prominent of these plans were offered by then House Minority Leader John Boehner and Senator Tom Coburn, a Republican, and Representative Paul Ryan, a Republican also. Now, Representative Ryan actually has offered some proposals in his budget that passed the House today, I believe, or yesterday. And his plan looks very different. It would repeal the Affordable Care Act in its entirety, and it would move Medicare to this sort of voucher system, but is unlikely to pass the Senate. So liberal alternatives, well, they look like about what you'd expect. They move to a more guaranteed coverage, a more guaranteed universal coverage model. They would go about this different ways. Pete Stark, a Democrat from California, would create, his plan would create a sort of Medicare for all plan. John Dingell, a representative from Michigan, has offered his plan every year since the late 50s, up until 2010. And that operates on a similar model. John Conyers, I think he's from Georgia, he has a single-payer program. And Bernie Sanders, the independent socialist from Vermont, offered a plan that would be a state-based plan, more similar to the Canadian system. So what would non-Affordable Care Act hybrids look like? Well, they wouldn't look terribly different from the Affordable Care Act. Former Senators Tom Daschle and Bob Dole both offered plans that looked very similar to the Affordable Care Act. They also expanded Medicaid, but not to the same extent as the Affordable Care Act. They created exchanges. They had an individual mandate. They also included an employer mandate, which the Affordable Care Act does not in earnestness. It has sort of an employer mandate light. There's the Widened Bennett plan, which was offered by Ron Wyden, a Democrat from Oregon, and Bob Bennett, a former Republican from Utah. He was ousted by the Tea Party in 2010. But their plan resembled the ACA. It was heavier on using market forces, but also heavier on some regulation. It would have eliminated Medicaid. Medicaid enrollees would have been moved into private insurance, for which they would have received generous subsidies. And so it worked in a very similar model to the ACA. The problem with both of these plans, of course, is that they have a major individual mandate problem. So it might be helpful to think about all these on a spectrum again, how they might relate to each other. Again, you might take issue with where I placed some of these, but I think they're all relatively close to where you might put them. But that might not be the right way to think about reforms. It might be more appropriate in this hyper-partisan and politicized environment to think about health reform in sort of a magnitude, a spectrum of magnitude. On one end, you have major systemic reforms. On the other end, you have the status quo. So you can see that when you sort of reorient the continuum, things change a bit. You get Cato and the liberal plans more as radical systemic changes, the Affordable Care Act towards the middle, the GOP plan a little bit closer to the status quo. So that's one way to think about it. If we do receive changes in the next couple of years, I think it's probably safe to predict that those changes will be rather incremental. Even if the White House goes to Mitt Romney next year, the Senate will still be, and even if the Senate flips control, there will still be, ought to be enough Democrats to prevent any legislation that Democrats don't like from going through. So that will mean a high degree of compromising, which, as we know, has not been this Congress's strength. But so if we think about these incremental reforms, again, you can see that I'm a linear thinker and I like continuums. But it might be useful to think about these incremental reforms along another continuum. At one end, you have market-directed reforms. So those would be attempting to use the forces of the free market without the intervention of government. At the other end, you'd have sort of regulatory changes, legal changes, more interventionist type reforms. So at the market-directed end, you might see things like payment reforms initiated by insurers and providers and provider networks, or business model reforms. A prominent business thinker named Clayton Christensen from Harvard released a book a couple of years ago in which he advocates for radical payment and business model reforms, and he says that's the solution. You might see state-based efforts towards the regulatory and legal end, which is already happening as states begin to implement exchanges. Whether or not those exchanges continue to operate under the Affordable Care Act remains to be seen, but some of those exchanges will operate regardless of whether or not the Affordable Care Act is upheld. And of course, tort reform, as we talked about. Another one that has been talked about a bit is patent reform, which would affect the cost of prescription drugs. And now, of course, it's important to remember that even though these would be incremental reforms, some of these could have huge effects down the line in the long run. Even though they wouldn't be systemic changes, they could have a major effect. So we shouldn't dismiss them as merely incremental, because they could in fact make a big impact. So the likeliest outcome, should the Affordable Care Act be found unconstitutional? Anybody want to place any bets? Yeah, I think at best we'll see marginal federal reforms, at best. And again, those reforms could be significant in the long run, but they wouldn't be systemic in any way. They wouldn't attempt to address the three problems that led to the push for health reform, which were the cost issue, the quality issue, and the access issue. They would likely address a small component of one of those. State experimentation, I think that is going to continue, especially as states have to deal with rising Medicaid rolls and costs, regardless of whether the ACA is found constitutional. And we'll see increased use of health savings accounts and high deductible health plans. These have already increased, the usage of these plans has already increased tremendously since 2003 and has really picked up in the past 5 or 6 years. Job-based coverage, as Dr. Damiano illustrated, has eroded considerably over the past 10 or 12 years. I think we're likely to see that continue because insurance costs continue to rise and because of the types of jobs that are being created in the economy right now. This is sort of harkens back to Clayton Christensen, who I mentioned. He's big on the idea that innovations can totally disrupt the way that businesses do their business and make things more affordable or more efficient. Will we see some change in technology, some change in the way care is delivered? Those are very difficult to predict. And we're probably likely to see continued growth in the uninsured population. And the question here, of course, is how high will it go? We're at 50 million right now. As the economy improves, will we see that budge? Will it hold steady? Will it continue to increase? How high will it go? How high will it go before people demand something happens? And with that, I think we are ready to take your questions.
I had a question about the severability of the individual mandate. What is the Supreme Court allowed to look at in order to decide if they view the individual mandate as being unconstitutional? What other factors are they allowed to take into account when they decide if other parts of the bill, like the pre-existing conditions, have to go down with it? Like, for example, do they have to look at congressional intent, and could that also lead to issues of economic due process because they're trying to make decisions about how that would affect private insurers, which they may or may not have the ability to do?
The ordinary test is the relationship between the provisions of the act that are struck down and the implementation of the other acts without that provision, and whether or not it would be rational to do so. So, for example, I think most people accept, in fact, the federal government argued that if you don't strike down the individual mandate, the federal government conceded that you have to give up the pre-existing condition. Since there was no party in the litigation who wanted to argue anything further than that, the court appointed a special counsel to come in and argue the rest of severability. But the reason is the rational relationship between what you strike down and whether the rest of it would make sense. But from the questions from the bench, it was pretty clear that they were really struggling with this issue.
I wanted to ask you about the preamble to the Constitution. I've read in Wikipedia that the preamble isn't considered as part of the body of the Constitution. But haven't laws been decided in the Supreme Court based on the preamble? Because it says domestic tranquility and the general welfare, and this is what this insurance is about. So, you know, they talked about taxes. If they had taxed it, it wouldn't be any problem because Congress can make taxes, so on and so forth. But could this preamble, you know, they always talk about they know everything that the original guys said. So this is what the original guys said. So could the law be decided on that?
Probably not, in terms of our constitutional jurisprudence. The preamble to the Constitution sets forth some what we call precatory language, aspirational, if you will, but nonetheless, when it gets down to the nitty-gritty, it's still got to be a specific power that's been granted to Congress. Now, that's not to say that we don't look to the aspirations in the preamble to give guidance and interpretation, but that's about as far as I think you can go with that. The preamble doesn't give the Congress a particular power.
So this is my last part of the question. So if the law goes down, then it's up to the people to change the Congress to make it go back through?
Yeah, I actually think Justice Scalia made that point, is, you know, if you don't, the way to deal with the law, you don't, if we strike this down, I think he said, the way you do it is, you know, redo the law, get different people in Congress. So, I mean, you know, or if you're happy with it being struck down, vote the way you wrote it, I guess. But, yeah, I mean, when the court strikes down a law, that doesn't mean that the Congress can't react by passing another law that addresses the constitutional infirmity. And it was one of the conservative justices who said if this had been a single-payer system, it's a no-brainer. It's clearly constitutional. But they didn't adopt a single-payer system, because a single-payer system, that's Medicare, okay? It's the largest, by the way, single-payer system in the world. And it's perfectly constitutional because it comes under the tax and spending power. Congress is, there's an act that Congress passed a few years ago that requires them to set forth what provision of the Constitution they're acting under. Yeah, there was a way to do it, but they didn't do it that way for a variety of, mostly political reasons.
Thank you.
I guess we're all asking you questions, Professor Kurtz. I just have a question. If the Supreme Court finds that the Affordable Care Act isn't justified by the Commerce Clause, does that put into doubt the National Labor Relations Act, Title VII, all of these other laws that have a Commerce Clause basis as their reason for being constitutional?
Could, okay. Keep in mind, up until, was it 1938, 39, the jurisprudence in this country created a very restricted view of what Congress could regulate under the Interstate Commerce Clause, and so back in the 20s, you struck down child labor laws, minimum wage laws, and all that turns around once you take on a more expansive view of what the Commerce Clause means. So depending on what happens when they write this decision, if they strike it down on Commerce Clause grounds, one's going to be carefully reading precisely what the infirmity was. But you could imagine a world in which they could go back to I always refer to it as Wickard and Filbert. That's the case involving wheat, the wheat farmer. Okay? So, I mean, yeah, you can go back to that theoretically. I don't think that's what's going to happen, but that could happen, sure.
My question is about how the power relates to policy. If insurance companies really want an individual mandate to increase their revenues to cover everyone, aren't they, or haven't they been lobbying to make sure the act stands? That's one part. And why is it that there's so much pushback against an act that contains policies that both sides had previously agreed on?
Tis a mystery.
Yeah. I think the second part you probably know the answer to already. The first part is interesting. I was in a meeting about 3 years ago in Des Moines, and one of the leaders at Principal Financial at the time was at this meeting, and he was talking to the group about how in the week before, the major health insurance agencies in Washington had just come out and had agreed to this proposal, basically that they would go along with getting rid of pre-existing conditions and annual maximums and all those kinds of things if there was an individual mandate, and was very proud of the fact that they were all working together to do that. Then have you heard them at other times, especially the advocacy groups against it? Yes, and then if you followed right even during the Supreme Court debate and right afterwards, then all of a sudden you saw some of them, well, gee, maybe we shouldn't have been doing, and careful what you wish for. And it's that thing, I think they wanted both. They wanted everything on their terms, and you have some community rating aspects of this that they didn't really like, and they would lose some control. And so they wanted everything on their terms. And I think many would argue that they got a lot on their terms right away. But by keep trying to push for that, they might have actually pushed themselves right out of this. And so it will be interesting to see.
I watched Frontline had a program on health insurance and the systems in Canada and Great Britain, other countries, Switzerland. I would like to ask Professor Kurtz, tell us the difference in their constitutions that allow those countries to have universal health care and us not to.
That's easy. They don't have constitutions. Okay, I think there may be a Canadian constitution, I'm not sure, but the Brits don't. They have what they call an unwritten constitution. What the big difference, let's put Canada aside for the moment and compare it to England. I don't really know much about Switzerland. But, we are a federal society. We are not a one government fits all society. So that's why under the U.S. Constitution, powers are reserved to the states, and then other powers are reserved to the federal government. That's not a phenomenon that you have to deal with in England, so the Parliament can simply decide. Another issue that you see in England is that it's the executive and the legislative branches are merged. That's not true in this country because of our commitment to checks and balances. So that would explain that. The Canadians, I don't know if they have a constitution, but do they? Yeah. But they're, so it's really hard for me to answer that question for you.
But actually, you already did earlier, in that those systems would be constitutional here. Again, a single-payer plan, like in Canada, as you pointed out, is constitutional.
But I don't know if it's because of their constitution or not.
Well,
I don't know the
right, but it's not that ours wouldn't allow what they have, which I think was where you were starting. Ours does.
Well, and as well, the Canadian health system is provincially based. And so a state-based system, like Massachusetts, which is very much like the Affordable Care Act, would be entirely constitutional. It's well within the state's rights, as both Professor Kurtz and Dr. Damiano mentioned.
Right. Well, and I think one of the things that we struggle with, I believe, with all of this is we try to pretend like we have a free market healthcare system when we don't. And, all of you are probably aware or have heard where health insurance, employer-based health insurance came from during World War II and the employer then when we couldn't provide more wages because of the wage and price freeze on, and so employers started offering benefits. And, it's not because we deemed that that was the right thing to do in a free market system. It's just sort of, again, what happened, just like our budgeting. And so you've got this real mix of wanting to believe that somehow if you work hard, you're going to get insurance, which unfortunately, again, isn't true. It's where you work, not how hard you work. And the fact that, over half of our spending is now Medicare and Medicaid and military and public health service and all of those things that we kind of exclude, plus the subsidies for all of us with private insurance that our employers get to write off, which is also, we're all on the public dole, and many people don't like to think about that aspect either. And so it's this really mix of it. I think it's the schizophrenic aspect, if you will, is how we view this, which makes it real challenging.
One thing I cannot understand is that one of the concerns the Republicans have is the cost. Certainly, Representative Ryan is concerned about the cost. But we have a system, a national system, which has an administrative cost of less than 2%. They say that they will limit under this new health plan to 20% for private multiple providers. The difference is 18%. That 18% would pay the cost of insurance for all the uninsured people. It could be done at no cost if they go to a single-payer system. And yet, the same people that want multiple-payer systems are complaining about the cost of having anything at all.
What do you think of that?
At that point, it's a religious issue.
This is for Professor Cannon. Very
I'm not a professor.
Oh, Mr. Cannon?
I'm flattered.
Simple little issue maybe compared to the whole thing, but you talked about health savings accounts.
Yeah.
And that sure wasn't, I had one, and it wasn't anything like what you said. I'm sorry. I had a good insurance plan, but my health savings was helpful for tax reasons. So I could put a certain amount of money every month in this, and then I could use it for dental, which I didn't have, and I could use it for some, for prescriptions. So it wasn't like I had to have this, I just kind of, my question is because you said it was like you had a huge, you had to buy a really expensive health care plan, and I already had one, so this was just like an additional little thing for tax reasons, actually.
Well, it's supposed to work in conjunction with a high deductible health plan.
No, I don't.
Was
mine sure didn't.
was it a flex savings?
It was a health savings account through Hills Bank, and it was great. And I personally am not a Bush backer, but he did initiate that.
You were using it for benefits not provided by your plan.
Exactly,
Yeah.
which was dental.
Well, you can do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I just wanted to clarify that because.
You didn't do anything wrong.
No, you're right.
And for me, it worked, and so it wasn't like kind of, I'm sorry, but it wasn't quite the bad thing as you were characterizing it.
No, I wasn't trying to characterize it as a bad thing.
Okay. So-
And some of it, I think, is whether it is your insurance or whether it's a supplement.
Yeah.
Okay.
And as the
And
when you have an account where you can put pre-tax dollars in and then you can use it for things that are non-covered, that's a little bit different than some of these healthcare
Right.
savings accounts where that is your primary insurance.
I think the motivation that led to it, even though, obviously whatever, you can have a motivation that leads to something, but then you can put it to other uses. But the motivation or the theory was, if we could have these health savings accounts, we could allow people who had them to take out high deductible health insurance policies and then pay less for those policies because the insurance companies wouldn't have as much risk to deal with, because you'd be putting money in your health savings accounts, getting the tax deduction, using that to take up most of the medical bills you'd incur during the course of the year. But that was the motivation.
That's right, and so
part of the motivation also is to try to change the way we think about health insurance. They want us to think, supporters of HSAs want us to think about health insurance the way we think about car insurance. When we go to get our oil changed, our car insurance doesn't cover that, right? We pay that out of pocket. And so that's sort of the idea behind high deductible health plans and health savings accounts, is that when consumers are paying more for their health care out of their own pockets, when it's not a third party that's in Des Moines or in Minneapolis or whatever, people are going to be more careful about the care they receive. Now, that's what's really up for debate, I think, about these things. Sure, you can choose your optometrist or ophthalmologist, but can you choose your emergency room doctor?
Right, and that's the thing that I think would be an interesting academic study, is what proportion of that $2.7 trillion is actually something on which you could make a decision. You think of where we're spending most of our dollars, whether it's end-of-life issues or trauma or, major, chronic diseases. Most of those things are not things that you can go and decide, in advance where you're going to go and actually even get a price for something so that you can shop. And to me, that's where that sort of falls apart when you're trying to expand it up to something more globally. Market forces in healthcare just don't work particularly well. And for the things that they do, you often don't want them. The lower cost preventive things. You don't want people, not going in for a well child visit, because they're going to save that money before they have to pay their deductible or get their immunizations or go in for an annual physical or whatever it is. And those are the things that are actually the lower cost, or like you mentioned, the ophthalmology or optometry or those kinds of things. When you're talking about things that are really driving our healthcare costs, and I couldn't tell you exactly what proportion, it's I think that would be interesting to look at, but it's not these things. And so that's where, to me, that model just doesn't hold when you try to make that the system.
Isn't the downside to the health savings accounts that the people who can afford them can often afford insurance other than major medical?
Sure.
And that's one of the major arguments you hear against them, as well as Pete's point about not being able to comparison shop for a number of medical services beforehand. But one of the arguments you hear is that health savings accounts do work great for people who are making, well above the poverty level. But for somebody who's making 100% of the federal poverty level, which is $14,000 or $22,000 for a family of four, up to maybe 200%, those probably aren't going to work very well. They're going to be stretched pretty thin, just meeting their basic needs, covering a mortgage or rent, child care likely, because younger families tend to have lower incomes, fuel costs, food costs, all those sorts of things. Once you account for all those costs, there's not going to be much room in the budget for most families to be putting several $100s into an account.
Well, I have tons of questions, but I have to follow my own mandate, so.
Oh, is there a shared responsibility?
So I'll just ask two quick ones. First, do you think that the Affordable Care Act will save money over the long term? And second, do you think that it's a well-written act in terms of implementing it at the various levels of implementation?
I'll let you respond to that. To will it save money, I can make a comment on whether it's well-written, but...
You want to go ahead and start?
Well-written. Well, I have a thing about all congressional acts. I think they're very hard to understand, and I think you made the point. And there is a rule of thumb out there, and I'm sure I'll exaggerate it, but it's something like for every page of statutes that Congress passes, you get 60 pages of regulations. That's, I'm sure, not the right proportion, and I think that's because Congress lays down general principles. I mean, to me, the scary thing, this has got nothing to do with the Affordable Care Act, except it's an example. The scary thing is, I mean, if you were to ask a congressman, and I don't care which way they voted, vote yes, vote no, did you read it before you voted? Well, of course not. I mean, and I can understand why they didn't. I actually have a copy I keep on my desk in the office, and it's this high, printed on both sides of the page. So, if the Congress people were reading this thing, I don't know what else they could possibly do. So, they have a concept, And that's basically what legislation often is. It's a concept, when we rely on our administrative agencies, and this is at the federal level, the state level to a lesser degree, but still true, to interpret. And then you wind up with cases in courts that are making judgments about whether the act is constitutional and then whether or not the administrative regulations are themselves valid. So, no, it's probably not the clearest thing. Certainly, I do not recommend it for nighttime reading.
Unless you have insomnia.
Unless you have insomnia, yeah. But, I mean, and it's just, I think that's true of a lot of federal legislation.
How about saving the money?
Yeah.
She asked that question.
That's Pete's.
Okay.
Pete,
In terms of,
I'm not a money guy.
yeah. Is this going to solve our healthcare cost inflation? No.
No.
What people hope is that will this bend the cost curve is the slang term that is used, maybe, but it's not going to be most of the things that we were talking about. It will be things like accountable care organizations. And if those can actually get put in place and the system doesn't figure out how to game it very quickly, which is what tends to happen, whether it's been HMOs or other kinds of managed care or whatever, and this is the next version of that. But there are some structural changes that are happening that are somewhat related to some of the incentives in this, but are likely to continue, and those are some of the things that I talked about at the end on that last slide. So, for example, the Health Information Exchange, or the Health Information Network as it's now being called. The state of Iowa is contracted with 3 different vendors, and they're setting up a health information network, which is going to allow all the largest health systems as well as the largest insurance companies to their systems to talk to each other. And it's going to start with an encrypted email type of system and will eventually be electronic health records. And there's a lot of emphasis in the ACA for pushing out electronic health records to providers and then electronic health information and communication. That's going to be huge potentially. And then you're going to be able to do much more coordinated care and move towards what's called patient-centered medical homes. And the idea there is that you've got people that are going to multiple providers, they might be getting multiple prescriptions, they might be getting drug-drug interactions, all of those things. And through both electronic communication, but also hopefully changes in provider behavior and connectedness, you might see improvements in quality. The other thing that I think about cost is so much is being driven right now by people with chronic illnesses, whether it's diabetes and, the obesity epidemic that's just, you look on the horizon is just huge and you keep hearing about, and asthma and congestive heart failure and Parkinson's disease and all of those things. That's, again, where our costs are. Does this deal with those things directly? No. Most of those things are actually requiring behavior change on both the part of the providers and the part of the patients. And to me, that's the holy grail of healthcare costs, which we don't know how to do very well. I mean, how many people don't know that they should eat better? How many people don't know they should exercise more? All of those things. Do we do it? Most of us don't to the extent that we should. And so you've got all of those things that are going to be playing into this, potential change if we're really going to get healthcare costs, and probably some things we're not going to like. Whether we're going to start saying if you smoke, it's going to cost you more. If but where do you draw those lines? If you don't exercise enough, you're going to pay more. I mean, are we really willing to do that? How are we going to judge nutrition? A lot of those things. And then one last aspect is our provider mix is wrong. And that's one of the things, if you look at international health spending, we're 80% among the physician providers, we're 80% specialists and 20% primary care providers. The rest of the world is the opposite. They're 80% primary care providers, 20% specialists. We want to go to the orthopedist when we tweak our knee right away as well. I mean, it's our fault too. We don't want to go to the family physician. But if we're going to have medical homes in the way we're talking about and having that person as a traffic cop and managing our care, we've got too many specialists. Are we really going to tell these specialists we're not going to pay you at the way that you're expected to get paid? At some point, we're going to have to, but we're not there. We've got a lot of those things that we're going to have to deal with.
Didn't the system you just described years ago with the HMO concept, you couldn't go to see a specialist without your primary care physician's recommendation or referral, and we hated that.
Right,
so we got rid.
exactly.
So isn't this just the old sheep in new clothes?
Even though it held costs steady, actually, for a few years when it became the dominant model.
Yeah. Right.
Patients rebelled against it.
But right, and then can ACOs be the new long-term solution? We'll see.
Yeah.
Well, as part of that,
Oh, I'm sorry, please. Go ahead, sir.
Well, the government spends a lot of time and energy saying that everyone's just an instant away of involuntarily entering the healthcare market, right? You're walking down the street, you get smacked by a bus, you're going to the hospital, right? But the anti-ACA advocates spend an equal amount of time saying, well, look, this act mandates stuff like substance abuse counseling, that mandate stuff like pediatric care that a substantial proportion of the population is just not going to use. So the constitutional principle you're relying on to make that constitutional is resulting in stuff that isn't related to that at all. So just as a legal matter, is it possible for the liberals plus Kennedy to say that...
Which Kennedy?
The one that's on the Supreme Court.
Okay.
Justice Kennedy.
Go ahead.
I don't think Patrick Kennedy's
Yeah.
opinion on this is much.
Zombie Kennedy.
Yeah.
So could a majority of the Supreme Court say that the mandate is constitutional, but it's only constitutional to mandate, emergency disaster care? And if that's possible as a legal matter, and that's what ends up happening, like what are the practical consequences of that? Is that, what's going to work, what's still going to work, what's obviously not going to work? Just what are the practical consequences going to be?
No.
Why not?
Well, because there's no legislation that provides for a mandate for that limited basis.
You know what? Well, actually, I'd mentioned the bronze, silver, gold, platinum level. And some are arguing, and again, you could take this or not, that the bronze level, yes, there's that whole list of things it has to cover, but it doesn't pay for those things. And so in many ways, that bronze level is somewhat of a catastrophic plan. And you can choose how much you want it to be paid for. Yes, it does provide maybe a broader laundry list than some might
No,
want.
but I don't think the court has the power to say the individual mandate is okay as long as you take the bronze plan and the rest of it.
No, I agree, but it's just that there is sort of a catastrophic plan that exists.
There is a choice. Yeah, there is a choice.
Right, and there
I
is
call
a
it the
choice.
credit card plans.
Yeah.
Bronze, silver, gold, platinum.
Yeah.
Well, the court spends a lot of time arguing over, the loaf that Congress passed isn't going to work. Is half a loaf better than no loaf? Is most of the loaf better than no loaf? And so there is, precedent for the court saying, well, the plan Congress passed isn't going to work. They didn't pass language saying what to do if this part doesn't work. But the plan, the parts that aren't going to work are constitutional, so we're going to uphold the parts that are constitutional and kick out, the parts that are not.
Oh, they can do that,
So-
but they can't change the provision. Yeah. But if I'm understanding your question, the court can't rewrite the statute. They can say, that's good, that's bad. Okay, and severability would allow them effectively to say, we're striking this down, but this is going to be retained. But it's not as if they're going to say that this is retained, but we're tweaking it to do this. That they don't have the authority to do.
Okay, so could they set a precedent saying that would be okay, but kick it back to Congress and then?
They can certainly, there have been cases in which the court says, if you'd done it this way, it would have been fine. Right, yeah. But
That'd be as far of a kickback to Congress
Yeah.
Congress as they'd give it.
Congress could do that without the court telling them.
Right.
If they want. It's up to Congress.
We'll take one more question, and then that's got to be it.
I'm glad that you brought up the issue of money, because that does seem...
It's all about money.
It does seem to drive the whole thing, and I did not go shopping to see which body shop could do my hip replacement. That whole idea of the free marketplace is ridiculous. But people are very afraid of what happens to their money, especially with, the way business has gone in the last 10 years or so. Insurance companies are making money with our money, and then they're saying, we can't afford to have you go to this many doctors, or you have a cap on what you can use. And it's the same thing with taxes. If we were giving taxes for a single-payer system, and you say, are my taxes going to fill a hole in the budget deficit, and will the money be there when I need it? So there's a lot of distrust about the businesses and about how much of so-called health care expenses by my doctor, for instance, is going for paperwork. I mean, we've got to do something about delivering health care to people who need health care. And money gets in the way. So what do we do?
Well, there have been interesting debates about the medical loss ratio that Dr. Damiano mentioned earlier, which is the 80% of premiums must go towards actual medical care. One of those interesting debates that I followed a bit was whether or not commissions to insurance brokers fell within the 80% limitation, or whether that was an administrative cost.
Huge battle.
It was a big battle, and it was behind the scenes. It was played out at the National Association of Insurance Commissioners and at the Department of Health and Human Services. Initially, the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, which is a group, the National Association of all the insurance commissioners, so the heads of Departments of Commerce or the Insurance Commission of each state meet together and develop model legislation and model rules and regulations. They had determined that fell outside of the medical loss ratio. It was part of the administrative costs. The broker associations disagreed with that vehemently, and they eventually got the Insurance Commissioners Association to reconsider that, and they've actually taken it up 3 or 4 times, I think, because of this pressure. So that is a major issue, how money is used and what we consider care, or what we consider adding value to health care.
And I jokingly mentioned that it's a religious issue. This is where I do consider it a small r religious issue. If you believe that government can handle those dollars better and you trust that they're going to be doing what you want, then you tend to be supportive of sort of the government type plans. If you believe that the private sector is better able to better handled and better positioned to do it, then you tend to support, a system that's going to drive people more into the private sector. There's not really a right or wrong on these things. We can talk about, the proportion that government is actually more efficient on Medicare and Medicaid administratively, but people who are sort of private sector oriented don't believe it or don't want to believe it or still think there's something good about not having it run by the government. And again, this isn't based on fact at that point. It's just sort of your personal belief on the way you think the government and the way the country should be going. And so, those are tough ones.
Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you to our guest speakers for their excellent presentations, and to our audience for your participation. And we'd also like to thank the Iowa City Public Library for this venue. We hope you have enjoyed these programs on the U.S. Constitution and the Supreme Court. If you would please take a moment on your way out to do 2 things. One is to complete the Humanities Iowa evaluation form. The form and pens are on the back table. Your feedback will help us win financial support for future programs. And please consider making a contribution to the League of Women Voters Education Fund. Your support will allow us to continue to bring quality programs to our community. There's a box out on the table outside where you can drop a check and information on the programs, on where to mail that check. Contributions to the education fund are tax deductible. We also have DVDs of these programs available in the series. We are asking for a donation of $5 for each DVD to help defray the cost. And also the DVDs will be available for viewing at sometime soon, I think, on our website, which is www.lwvjc.org. Again, thank you all for coming tonight and supporting us over this series for these past 9 months. Thank you very much.